On July 23, 1877, San Francisco was set ablaze by the flames of hatred. First a labor gathering, but now a bloodthirsty mob, rioting workers advanced on Chinatown, burning businesses, laundries, and lumber yards for 3 days. Soon, anti-Chinese rallies became commonplace, led by the Working Men's Party and their leader, Dennis Kearney, who coined the phrase, "The Chinese must go." In one speech to a Working Men's Party crowd, Dennis Kearney said,
"The capitalistic thief and the land pirate of California, instead of employing the poor white man of the beautiful and golden state, sent across to Asia, the oldest despotism on earth, and there, contracting with a band of leprous Chinese pirates, brought them to California, and now uses them as a knife to cut the throats of honest laboring men in that state."
Anti-Chinese provocation like Kearney stoked the fires of racism. Kearney's incendiary rhetoric, the rise of anti-Chinese sentiment, and the rise of violent protests in California and across the country encouraged both political parties to compromise with white workers and adopt anti-Chinese policies, eventually peaking with the Chinese Exclusion Act. The 19th century was characterized by immigration. In the East Coast, immigrants were arriving from European countries such as Ireland and Germany. On the West Coast, immigrants were fervently chasing a new opportunity. On January 24, 1848, James W. Marshall found gold in California, triggering mass migration to the West. Along with westbound Americans, one particularly large group following the rumors of gold were Chinese immigrants. They arrived in an attempt to search for gold in order to send back to their families in China. When they were originally welcomed, they served as gold panners, cooks, and servants. But as the gold dried up and wealth seekers continued to pile into the fields, the American gold hunters turned against each other, especially towards the foreigners. The Chinese, in particular, were singled out due to their distinct appearance and culture, as well as their tendency to work for lower wages than their white counterparts. Even Irish foreigners, who were Catholics rather than Protestants, were seen as Americanizable because of their similar language and skin color, whereas Chinese immigrants were seen as un-Americanizable. White Americans had to compete with the lower wages accepted by Chinese workers. Eventually, this competition stirred up animosity towards the Chinese, most notably in California. Even before the Chinese Exclusion Act, the California government tried to pass several laws discriminating against Chinese workers, such as the Foreign Miners License Tax and the Anti-Coolie Act. However, these were soon declared unconstitutional. Then, as construction of the Transcontinental Railroad began to link the nation together in 1863, railroad companies were in need of workers. Divided into two pieces, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed by the joint efforts of the Central Pacific Railroad in the west and the Union Pacific Railroad in the east. This daunting task required a multitude of workers and the completion of dangerous jobs, especially in the Central Pacific Railroad. The builders were generally expected to use volatile nitroglycerin to bore holes in the mountains for the railroad track. Because of the perilous explosions that killed many laborers, people were reluctant to take the job. To remedy this depression of workers, Charles Kroencke began hiring Chinese laborers to work on the Central Pacific Railroad. Soon, they ended up constituting about 80% of the Central Pacific Railroad's workforce. After racism against the Chinese in local communities completely drove them out of mining, the Chinese turned to railroad building. Since they were cheaper workers, railroad companies were especially eager to employ them. Jobless white workers, on the other hand, were not so eager to accept them. In 1873, the problem of unemployment became exacerbated by nationwide economic depression. White workers were brimming with hatred for the railroad capitalists and the Chinese laborers they employed. During the evening of July 23, 1877, a socialist group called for a mass meeting of workers in a San Francisco sandlot. While the leaders had made no mention of the Chinese, soon the violent mob charged into Chinatown, where the rioting left 20 Chinese laundries destroyed. Soon afterward, in August 1877, an Irishman named Dennis Kearney formed the new Working Men's Party of California, which pushed a strong anti-Chinese platform. He quickly gained notoriety with his extreme rhetoric. The group welcomed many different white demographics. Dennis Kearney once said,
"We don't meet here as Irish, English, Scottish, nor Dutch, nor are we Catholics, Protestants, atheists, or infidels. Let there be no sect.
As CUNY grew in popularity, political discourse began to incorporate an increasingly anti-Chinese element. A prominent nativist publication was The Wasp, a San Francisco newspaper. After 1877, they ramped up their propaganda against the Chinese, with cartoonist George Frederick Keller drawing acid anti-Chinese political cartoons. This cartoon, titled The Chinese Must Go, But Who Keeps Them?, was published by The Wasp on May 11, 1878. The cartoon depicts Dennis CUNY as a donkey braying the Working Men's Party slogan, "The Chinese Must Go." White customers can be seen purchasing cigarettes from a Chinese shop, riding a carriage manned by a Chinese person, getting clothes fixed at a Chinese business, and buying other services offered by Chinese people. The Wasp blames white people who buy from Chinese shops for maintaining their presence, showing how racists would not be satisfied until Chinese people were totally pushed out of society, not just dropped from jobs where they lowered wages. Soon, CUNY and his party worms their way into the California Constitutional Convention, and CUNYism, or anti-Chinese hatred, took a hold of the Californian government. The Chinese problem reached the federal level as both parties began to promote anti-Chinese policies to appeal to CUNYites. The first attempt at a formal Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by Congress in 1878, but President Rutherford B. Hayes vetoed the act. But by 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act successfully made its way into the national spotlight. The act was passed by Congress in the spring of 1882 and signed by U.S. President Chester A. Arthur. It barred the entrance of Chinese immigrants into the United States for the next 10 years. Immediately, Chinese immigration dropped from about 40,000 to lower than 250 people between 1881 and 1883. They had to obtain a certification to even re-enter the country with the institution of the Scott Act in 1888. Once 1892 hit, the 10-year prohibition on Chinese immigration had expired. But in an attempt to further appease the blue-collar white men, California Representative Thomas J. Gary and Congress reinstated the Chinese Exclusion Act through the Gary Act. In addition to the terms of the original act, it forced Chinese laborers already inside the states to keep an up-to-date copy of their certificate of residence. Without this internal passport, they could face immediate deportation. The Gary Act still had some amount of protections for legal Chinese immigrants and non-laborious Chinese citizens regarding prosecution and deportation, so many Californian workers were disappointed with the limitations of the act. However, the Gary Act still continued the Chinese Exclusion Act from its expected final date by extending it 10 years, eventually making it permanent in 1902. After 41 years of Chinese exclusion, the act was repealed with the Magnuson Act of 1943, led by Washington Representative Warren G. Magnuson. Despite its eventual repeal, the Chinese Exclusion Act still had far-reaching consequences.
The Chinese Exclusion Act banned immigration from China on the basis of race, and by stipulating that Chinese immigrants were not eligible for U.S. citizenship, it reaffirmed a racist principle that only white people could be naturalized.
In addition,
in 1917, the U.S. created the Barred Zone to exclude immigration from countries like India. In 1924, the attempt to exclude Japanese immigration was completed.
the Chinese Exclusion Act set a precedent for these cases. We can learn from the Chinese Exclusion Act what not to do regarding immigration, especially from the Working Men's Party. Rather than attacking the Chinese, the Working Men's Party should really have focused on fighting against the corrupt practices of the railroad companies. But this would have caused trouble with the federal and state government, who monetarily and ideologically supported the railroads. However, shifting the focus to the Chinese problem, as it was called at the time, allowed a convenient compromise. Working men could satisfy their hatred and bloodlust while being distracted from the callous treatment of railroad workers. Even the Republican Party, which otherwise would have been pro-Chinese, supported Chinese exclusion to appeal to the working men. In contemporary society, immigration still remains a highly debated topic. However, we should not capitulate to the discriminatory demands of bodies like the Working Men's Party. Similar to the Chinese immigrants of the past, undocumented immigrants today do physical labor for low wages. Both are exploited by their employers. Rather than targeting immigrants who are trying to pursue the American ideal of self-improvement, we should focus on the employers who pay them meager wages. By having compassion for these abused immigrant groups, our country will uphold the American principles of equality, empathy, and inclusiveness.